The steady beeping of the heart monitor wasn't the sound that woke me from my post-surgery haze. It was the familiar voice of my eldest son, Brian, speaking in hushed but urgent tones just outside my recovery room door. What he said next made my blood run colder than the IV fluids coursing through my veins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Look, we need to discuss this now while she's still under. The house has to go on the market within the month. I've already spoken to a realtor. I lay perfectly still, eyes closed, as the anesthesia slowly lifted its fog from my mind. Dr. Wong had warned me that heart surgery patients often experience periods of semi-consciousness where they could hear conversations but couldn't respond. I never imagined I'd be grateful for this medical phenomenon. "Brian, that's Mom's house," came Stephanie's voice, though it lacked the conviction I'd hoped to hear from my only daughter. "She just had major surgery. Don't you think we should wait until she recovers?" "Recovers from what?" Brian's laugh was bitter. "Steph, she's 67 years old. She just had a triple bypass. The doctors said there could be complications, cognitive decline, who knows what else. We can't wait around hoping for the best while that house sits there eating up money in property taxes and maintenance." My heart, freshly repaired with new arteries, began to race. The monitor's beeping quickened, but my children were too absorbed in their conversation to notice. "The market's hot right now," Brian continued. "That Victorian could easily sell for $800,000, maybe more. Split 3 ways. That's enough for each of us to finally get ahead. Mike's got those student loans. You've got the divorce debt. And I need to think about my kids' college funds." Michael, my youngest, finally spoke up. His voice was quieter, more uncertain. "I don't know, guys. This feels wrong. Mom worked her whole life for that house. She and Dad restored every inch of it themselves." "Exactly," Brian said, his voice gaining momentum. "They restored it, increased its value, and now it's time to cash in. Mom's not going to be able to maintain a 3-story Victorian on her own. She can barely handle the stairs on a good day, and after this surgery? Come on, be realistic." The conversation continued, but I forced myself to remain motionless as nurses moved around my bed, checking my vitals and adjusting my IV. Each word from my children felt like another incision, deeper than anything Dr. Wong had made in my chest. These were the same children I'd raised in that house, the same house where I'd nursed them through fevers, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and celebrated every milestone of their lives. The house they were so casually discussing wasn't just property to me. It was 28 years of love, sweat, and dreams made manifest. When James and I first saw the neglected Victorian on Magnolia Street, most people thought we were crazy. The roof leaked, the foundation needed work, and the previous owners had painted over beautiful original hardwood with layers of cheap latex. But James and I saw its potential, just like we saw potential in each other when we married young with nothing but hope and determination. We'd spent our weekends for the first 5 years of our marriage stripping paint, refinishing floors, and slowly bringing the house back to its 1890s glory. James had learned plumbing from YouTube videos when we couldn't afford a contractor. I'd taught myself to rewire electrical fixtures after checking out every home improvement book our local library had. We'd planted the garden together, choosing each rose bush and fruit tree with care, planning for the future when our children would play under the old oak in the backyard. That oak tree had held 3 different tire swings over the years, one for each child. It had shaded countless birthday parties, graduation celebrations, and family barbecues. Its branches had witnessed first steps, first dates, and tearful goodbyes when each of my children left for college. The thought of strangers cutting it down for easier lawn maintenance made my chest tighten with more than just surgical pain. James had passed away 3 years ago after a sudden heart attack. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now lying in a hospital bed with my own heart issues, listening to my children plan the dismantling of everything he and I had built together. After his funeral, I'd wondered how I would manage the house alone, but I'd been determined to try. The garden still needed tending, the Victorian still needed its careful maintenance, and I wasn't ready to let go of the place where I felt closest, to James's memory. I'd managed better than anyone expected, including myself. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had been amazed at how well I'd kept up the yard work. The truth was, physical labor helped with the grief. Pruning the roses James had planted reminded me of his gentle hands. Painting the porch railings we'd installed together made me feel connected to him. The house wasn't just shelter, it was the physical embodiment of our partnership. But apparently, my children saw it differently. As consciousness fully returned and the nurses finished their rounds, I heard Brian's voice again, closer now. He must have stepped into my room. "Her color looks better," he said, presumably to his siblings. "The doctor said the surgery went well, but recovery will be long. Months of physical therapy, medication management, lifestyle changes. She's going to need help with everything." "We could hire someone," Michael suggested. "A home health aide or something." "Do you know what that costs?" Brian's voice sharpened. $15 to $20 an hour, and that's just for basic care. If she needs skilled nursing, it's even more. The money from the house sale would cover her care for years. We could find her a nice assisted living place, somewhere with medical staff on site. Assisted living. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I'd visited friends in those facilities, sterile places with scheduled activities and shared dining rooms where elderly residents were warehoused until they died. The thought of leaving my garden, my workshop, my memories, for a one-bedroom apartment with institutional furniture made me want to rip out my own IV. "There are some really nice places," Stephanie added, and I could hear her warming to the idea. "Golden Years Manor has a memory care unit too, just in case she develops dementia later. It would be good planning." Memory care, as if my children had already decided my mind was failing along with my heart. I wanted to sit up and remind them that I'd been managing the finances for Carter and Henderson Landscaping until just 6 months ago, when I'd finally agreed to let Frank take over the books. I'd been balancing checkbooks and negotiating contracts while they were still in diapers. My mind was as sharp as ever, sharper perhaps than theirs if they thought I wouldn't notice being pushed out of my own life. The landscaping business was another thing they apparently knew nothing about. James and I had started Carter and Henderson Landscaping 32 years ago, with a borrowed truck and a handful of clients. Over the decades, we'd built it into one of Riverside's most respected garden design companies. We specialized in drought-resistant, native plants and sustainable landscape solutions, work that had become increasingly valuable as California faced ongoing water shortages. Frank Henderson had been James's best friend since high school and my business partner for over 3 decades. When James died, Frank had insisted on buying out his share of the business, leaving me with a substantial sum that I'd invested wisely. My children assumed I was living on James's life insurance and Social Security, but the reality was far different. Between the business sale and my carefully managed investment portfolio, I was worth considerably more than they imagined. But I'd never felt the need to discuss my finances with my adult children. They had their own lives, their own careers, their own financial responsibilities. Brian worked in pharmaceutical sales and earned a decent living, though he'd never been good with money. Stephanie had struggled financially since her divorce, but she was slowly rebuilding her credit and her confidence. Michael was finishing his PhD in environmental science, and while his student loans were substantial, his future earning potential was strong. None of them were in dire financial straits, yet they spoke about my house as if it were their inheritance being withheld rather than my home where I intended to live for many more years. The sense of entitlement in their voices was shocking. When had my children become strangers who saw my life as an inconvenience to be managed? "We should probably talk to that lawyer Dad used," Brian was saying. Find out what the process looks like for getting power of attorney if mom's not able to make decisions for herself. She just had surgery, Michael protested. She's not incompetent. Not yet, Brian replied ominously. But heart surgery at her age can cause complications. Cognitive issues, depression, increased risk of stroke. We need to be prepared. The casual way he discussed my potential incapacity made my hands clench under the hospital blankets. I'd raised these children to be compassionate, thoughtful people. Brian had been the one who brought home injured birds to nurse back to health. Stephanie had organized food drives for homeless shelters in high school. Michael had chosen environmental science because he wanted to make the world better for future generations. Where were those caring people now? A new voice joined the conversation. Dr. Wong had entered my room, her professional tone cutting through my children's scheming. "Good evening," she said. "I wanted to check on your mother's progress. The surgery went very well. We were able to clear all 3 blockages, and her heart is responding beautifully to the new blood flow." "That's wonderful news," Stephanie said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. "What does recovery look like?" "With proper care and rehabilitation, your mother should make a full recovery," Dr. Wong explained. "The next few weeks will be crucial, but I expect her to return to most normal activities within 2 to 3 months. Many patients her age go on to live active, independent lives for many years after this procedure." I wanted to cheer. Dr. Wong was essentially telling my children that I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, that their plans for assisted living and house sales were premature at best. "But there are risks, right?" Brian pressed. "Complications that could affect her ability to live alone?" "Every surgery carries risks," Dr. Wong replied carefully. "But your mother is in excellent health otherwise. Her recovery should be straightforward, as long as she follows the rehabilitation protocol and has adequate support at home." "Support at home," Brian repeated. "That's what we're concerned about. The house is large, 3 stories, lots of maintenance. We're worried about her managing on her own. Many patients benefit from having family nearby during the initial recovery period," Dr. Wong agreed. "But independence is often the best motivator for healing. Patients who return to familiar environments with proper support systems tend to recover more quickly than those who make major life changes while healing. In other words, don't warehouse me in assisted living while I'm trying to recover from major surgery." Dr. Wong was clearly on my side, though she didn't know she was, taking sides in a family battle. After the doctor left, my children continued their discussion in lower voices. They talked about staging the house for sale, getting multiple appraisals, and researching moving companies. They discussed my belongings as if I were already dead, debating which furniture would fit in an assisted living apartment and which would need to be sold or donated. "Mom's got some nice antiques," Stephanie observed. "That dining room set alone could be worth $5,000. The garden. Tools and workshop equipment won't be worth much," Michael added. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But there might be some value in Dad's woodworking tools. They were liquidating my life piece by piece, and I was powerless to stop them while trapped in this hospital bed. But as I lay there listening, a cold anger began to replace my initial shock and hurt. My children had underestimated me before. When James died, they'd assumed I'd need their help managing everything. When I'd continued working at the landscaping business, they'd been surprised by my competence. When I'd handled the insurance claims and legal paperwork after James's death, they'd seemed shocked that I could navigate such complexities alone. Now they were making the same mistake again, assuming I was frail and helpless because I'd needed medical intervention. They forgot that I'd been making tough decisions and solving problems long before they were born. They forgot that I'd helped build a successful business from nothing. Most importantly, they forgot that mothers don't become pushovers just because they grow older. Frank Henderson would never go along with their plans. He'd been checking on me regularly since James's death, helping with heavy yard work and keeping an eye on the house when I traveled. Frank knew my true financial situation because he'd helped me invest the money from James's share of the business. He also knew how much the house meant to me, how much work James and I had put into it, and how important it was for me to maintain my independence. But beyond Frank's support, I had resources my children didn't know about. The landscaping business had been more successful than we'd ever let on. We'd been conservative people, living modestly despite our growing wealth. James and I had invested in real estate beyond our primary residence, owning 2 rental properties and a small commercial building that housed our business offices. We'd been careful to keep these investments in our business names rather than personal names, partly for tax purposes and partly because we'd seen too many families torn apart by money. My children thought they knew my financial situation, but they'd never asked for details. They assumed that because I lived simply and drove an older car, I must be struggling financially. They didn't know about the investment accounts that had grown substantially over the past 3 years, or the life insurance policy that was far larger than they imagined, or the business assets that would eventually come to them anyway when the time was right. What they also didn't know was that I'd been planning for this moment, not the surgery necessarily, but the moment when age might make me vulnerable to well-meaning but misguided family interference. James and I had discussed it extensively after watching his brother's children essentially take over his life when he'd developed early-stage dementia. We'd seen how quickly autonomy could disappear when adult children decided their parent needed help. I'd put legal protections in place, working with our family attorney to ensure that my wishes would be respected, even if my children disagreed with them. The house couldn't be sold without my explicit consent, regardless of any power of attorney arrangements. My medical decisions were protected by advance directives that specified my preference for recovering at home. Most importantly, I'd established a trust that would provide for my care without requiring my children to make financial decisions on my behalf. But as I listened to their continued planning, I realized that legal protections would only go so far. My children genuinely believed they were acting in my best interests, even as they ignored my expressed wishes to remain in my home. They'd convinced themselves that I was no longer capable of making sound decisions, that their intervention was necessary for my well-being. This wasn't malicious behavior, which somehow made it worse. If they'd been greedy strangers trying to steal my assets, I could have fought them with clear conscience. Instead, these were my children, people I loved deeply, who had apparently decided that love meant taking control of my life whether I wanted them to or not. The nurse returned to check my vitals again, and my children stepped away from the bed. I heard them making plans to meet the next morning to begin researching assisted living facilities. Brian would contact realtors for market assessments. Stephanie would look into legal requirements for medical guardianship. Michael would research moving companies and storage facilities. They had divided up the task of dismantling my life with the same efficiency they'd once shown in organizing family holidays. The coordination would have been impressive if it hadn't been so devastating. In less than 4 hours since my surgery, they'd moved from concern for my health to detailed planning for my displacement. As visiting hours ended and my children prepared to leave, I heard each of them approach my bedside. Stephanie kissed my forehead and whispered that she loved me. Michael squeezed my hand and promised to be back in the morning. Brian patted my shoulder and said he'd take care of everything so I didn't have to worry. Take care of everything. The phrase echoed in my mind long after they'd gone. They truly believed they were helping me by removing every choice and decision from my hands. They'd forgotten that taking care of someone didn't mean taking over their life. Alone in the recovery room with only the steady beeping of monitors. For company, I finally opened my eyes and began to plan. My children had made a critical error in assuming I was as helpless as I appeared. They'd forgotten that I'd been navigating complex situations and outmaneuvering opponents in business for decades. They'd forgotten that their father and I had built everything we had through careful strategy and determination. Most importantly, they'd forgotten that a mother's love doesn't make her weak. It makes her fierce when her family is threatened, even when the threat comes from within the family itself. My children wanted to take care of me, but they were about to learn that Linda Carter was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as my children began implementing their plans. But tonight, I would rest and prepare for the battle ahead. They thought they were protecting a fragile old woman. Instead, they were about to face the full force of a mother who had no intention of going quietly into managed care. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, marking time until I could reclaim my life from the children who thought they knew what was best for me. They were about to discover that recovery meant more than just healing from surgery. It meant recovering everything they thought they could take away. The morning brought fresh pain and unwelcome visitors. My chest felt like someone had driven a truck through it, which wasn't far from the truth, considering they'd cracked my sternum open 12 hours earlier. But the physical discomfort paled in comparison to watching my children walk into my hospital room with clipboards, real estate flyers, and the confident smiles of people who'd already made life-altering decisions on my behalf. "Good morning." "Mom?" Stephanie chirped, setting down a stack of glossy brochures on my bedside table. "You look so much better today. How are you feeling?" Before I could answer, Brian was already rearranging the visitor chairs and pulling out his phone. "I've got the realtor coming by the house this afternoon for a preliminary assessment. Sandra. Martinez, she's supposed to be the best in Riverside. Sold the Henderson place down the street for $50,000 over asking price." The Henderson place. I knew that sale well because Frank had told me all about it. His elderly neighbor had been pressured by her son to sell quickly, accepting the first offer rather than waiting for the market to respond properly. She'd lost money because of impatience and family pressure. The irony of Brian using this as his success story wasn't lost on me. "That seems premature," I managed to say, my voice still hoarse from the breathing tube. "I just had surgery yesterday." "Which is exactly why we need to get ahead of this," Michael said, though he looked uncomfortable as he spoke. "Dr. Wong said recovery could take months. The spring real estate market won't wait for us." Us. As if my house had suddenly become a family committee decision. I watched Michael fidget with his graduate school ring, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. At least he seemed conflicted about their plan, unlike his siblings who appeared to have fully embraced the role of benevolent dictators. A nurse entered to check my vital signs, interrupting Brian's detailed explanation of market timing and competitive pricing strategies. While she worked, I caught fragments of whispered conversations between my children. They'd been busy during the night, apparently making phone calls and research lists while I lay recovering from major surgery. "The lawyer can see us this afternoon," Stephanie murmured to Brian, "right after the realtor appointment." "What about the assisted living tours?" Michael asked. "Tomorrow morning. I've scheduled 3 facilities, all highly rated with medical staff on site." They were moving with military precision, as if they'd rehearsed this takeover for years. Perhaps they had, waiting for the right moment when they could justify their intervention. A heart attack would have been too sudden, but scheduled surgery gave them time to plan and prepare for their assumption of control over my life. After the nurse left, Brian pulled his chair closer to my bed with the serious expression he'd worn since childhood when delivering important news, like the time he'd broken my favorite vase, or when he'd decided to change his college major for the 3rd time. "Mom, we need to talk about practical matters. I know this isn't what you want to think about right now, but we can't ignore reality." Reality according to whom, I wondered. My reality included resources and options they couldn't imagine, but their reality apparently consisted of a helpless old woman who needed their immediate rescue. "The house is too much for you to handle alone," he continued. "Even before the surgery, you were struggling with maintenance issues." This was news to me. I'd kept the Victorian in excellent condition, handling minor repairs myself, and calling professionals for anything beyond my skill level. Frank helped with heavier tasks like gutter cleaning and tree trimming, but I'd managed everything else just fine. When had Brian last visited to assess my maintenance capabilities? Easter dinner 3 months ago, when he'd spent the entire time on his phone dealing with work emergencies. The roof needs work, Stephanie added, and the heating system is ancient. The roof had been inspected and partially replaced just 2 years ago. The heating system, while vintage, had been meticulously maintained by the same company that had serviced it for 15 years. But my children weren't interested in facts that contradicted their narrative of decay and decline. "We've found some really beautiful places for you to live," Stephanie continued, opening one of her brochures with practiced enthusiasm. "Golden Years Manor has a lovely garden courtyard, organized activities, and nursing staff available 24 hours a day." I glanced at the brochure photos showing elderly residents playing bingo and doing chair exercises in a sterile community room. The garden courtyard was a small patch of drought-resistant plants surrounded by concrete walkways. It looked nothing like the acre of roses, fruit trees, and vegetable beds that I tended at home. "They have a memory care unit, too," Brian C. added helpfully. "Just in case you develop cognitive issues later. It's good to plan ahead." The casual assumption that I would inevitably need memory care was particularly galling. My mind was as sharp as ever, sharper perhaps than my children's if they thought I'd meekly accept their plans without resistance. I'd been solving complex problems and making strategic decisions while they were still figuring out how to tie their shoes. "I want to stay in my own home," I said clearly, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "The house means everything to me. Your father and I built that life together." "We know it's emotional," Michael said gently, "but emotions can't override practical concerns. You need medical supervision, help with daily activities, social interaction with people your own age. People my own age, as if 67 made. Me a member of some separate species that could only relate to others with similar birth years. I had friends of all ages, from my elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson to my young colleague Maria who'd joined our landscaping business 5 years ago. Age had never been a barrier to meaningful relationships in my experience. "What about hiring help to come to the house?" I suggested. "A housekeeper, maybe someone to help with grocery shopping and appointments?" "That's incredibly expensive," Brian replied immediately. "Quality home care costs $15 to $20 an hour, and you'd need coverage for at least 8 hours a day. That's over $3,000 a month, not including benefits and insurance." His math was suspiciously precise, as if he'd already researched alternatives only to dismiss them as financially impossible. But his calculations assumed I was living on a fixed income with limited resources. The reality was that I could afford full-time care for years without touching my principal investments. "The money from selling the house would cover your care for decades," Stephanie added. "You could live comfortably without worrying about expenses or maintenance issues." They kept returning to the money from the house sale as if it were already decided, already theirs to manage on my behalf. The casualness with which they discussed liquidating my life's work was breathtaking. Did they think I wouldn't notice their constant references to "when we sell" rather than "if we sell"? A knock on the door interrupted our increasingly tense conversation. Frank Henderson's familiar face appeared in the doorway, holding a small, potted orchid and wearing the concerned expression of a true friend. Relief washed over me so powerfully that tears sprang to my eyes. "Linda, how are you feeling?" he asked, crossing the room to squeeze my hand gently. "I came as soon as visiting hour started." "Much better now," I said, meaning it completely. Frank's presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in this battle, that someone understood what my home and independence meant to me. My children exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared opinion of Frank as an unwelcome complication to their plans. They tolerated him because he'd been James's friend, but they'd never appreciated his continued involvement in my life after the funeral. "Frank, good to see you," Brian said with forced politeness. We were just discussing Mom's living situation moving forward. Oh? Frank's eyebrows rose as he took in the real estate brochures and assisted living pamphlets scattered across my bedside table. And what have you decided? The question was directed at me, not my children, which I appreciated more than he could know. At least someone still believed I was capable of making my own decisions. We haven't decided anything, I said firmly, earning sharp looks from Brian and Stephanie. The children have some ideas, but I haven't agreed to any changes. Good, Frank said simply. Major decisions shouldn't be rushed, especially during recovery from surgery. With respect, Mr. Henderson, Brian interrupted, this isn't really your decision to make. We're talking about family matters. Frank's expression hardened slightly. He'd known my children since they were babies, had attended their birthday parties and graduation ceremonies, had been like an uncle to them throughout their childhood. Brian's dismissive tone was both rude and short-sighted. You're right, Frank agreed. It's Linda's decision to make. I'm just here to support whatever she chooses. The contrast between Frank's approach and my children's was stark. He offered support for my choices, while they offered to make choices for me. He trusted my judgment, while they assumed my judgment was impaired. He respected my autonomy, while they planned to eliminate it entirely. The thing is, Stephanie said carefully, Mom might not be thinking clearly right now. Anesthesia can affect cognitive function, and she's on pain medications that could impair her decision-making ability. Frank looked at me directly. Linda, do you feel like your thinking is impaired right now? Not at all, I replied. I understand everything that's being discussed, and I'm capable of making my own decisions. There you have it, Frank said to my children. Your mother seems perfectly lucid to me. Brian's jaw tightened with frustration. He wasn't used to having his authority questioned, especially not by someone he considered an outsider to family. Business. In his pharmaceutical sales career, he was accustomed to being the expert in the room, the one with answers and solutions. Having Frank challenge his expertise in managing my life clearly rankled. Look, I appreciate your concern, Brian said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he probably used with difficult doctors. But we're talking about long-term care planning, financial management, and medical supervision. These are complex issues that require careful consideration. I agree completely, Frank replied, which is why Linda should have time to consider all her options without pressure to make immediate decisions. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We're not pressuring anyone. We're just trying to be proactive about Mom's needs. By scheduling realtor appointments and assisted living tours without her input? Frank's question hung in the air like an accusation. Stephanie flushed. We're gathering information so Mom can make an informed choice. By presenting only the options you've pre-selected, Frank observed. What about the option of staying? In her own home with support services? What about modifying the house to make it more accessible? What about exploring community resources for seniors who want to age in place? I wanted to applaud. Frank was systematically dismantling their arguments while offering genuine alternatives they hadn't bothered to research. He understood that my children had started with their preferred conclusion and worked backward to justify it, rather than starting with my needs and exploring all possible solutions. Those options are expensive and complicated, Brian protested. The assisted living facility provides everything in one location: medical care, meals, housekeeping, social activities. It's a comprehensive solution. For someone who wants that lifestyle, Frank agreed. But Linda has never expressed interest in institutional living. She's always been independent, active in her community, connected to her home and garden. Why would you assume she'd suddenly want to change everything about how she lives? It was a fair question that my children couldn't answer honestly. The truth was that they wanted me to change everything about how I lived, because it would be more convenient for them. An assisted living facility would eliminate their worry about my welfare while freeing up substantial assets for their own use. My actual preferences were secondary to their peace of mind and financial interests. Things change when people get older, Stephanie said defensively. Independence becomes less important than safety and security. Says who? Frank challenged. Did Linda tell you that independence had become less important to her? Silence. Because of course I'd never said anything of the kind. I'd consistently expressed my desire to remain in my home, to maintain my independence, to continue living according to my own preferences and schedule. My children had simply decided that my expressed wishes were no longer relevant. Dr. Wong chose that moment to enter for her morning rounds, interrupting the increasingly tense conversation. She reviewed my chart, checked my incisions, and asked about my pain levels and sleep quality. Everything was progressing well, she reported, exactly as expected for a successful surgery. When can I expect to go home? I asked, hoping my children were listening carefully to her answer. Probably day after tomorrow if your recovery continues at this pace, she replied. We'll want to see you walking comfortably and managing stairs before discharge. Do you have support at home for the first few weeks? Before I could answer, Brian jumped in. Actually, doctor, we're concerned about her living situation. The house has multiple levels, and she'll be alone most of the time. We're looking at assisted living options with medical staff available. Dr. Wong turned to me with a questioning look. Is that what you want, Mrs. Carter? No, I said clearly. I want to go home to my own house. I have friends who can help if I need assistance. Many patients prefer to recover in familiar surroundings, Dr. Wong agreed. As long as you have adequate support and follow the rehabilitation protocol, home recovery is often preferable to institutional care. I could practically see Brian's blood pressure rising. The medical professional was contradicting his carefully constructed argument about my need for supervised care. Dr. Wong's casual dismissal of assisted living as unnecessary probably felt like a personal attack on his judgment. But what about stairs? Stephanie pressed. And meal preparation and medication management? All manageable with proper planning, Dr. Wong replied. Many patients arrange for temporary modifications like a downstairs bedroom if stairs are initially difficult. Meal. Delivery services are available, and medication organizers help with prescription management. The key is maintaining independence while ensuring safety. Frank nodded approvingly. I've already offered to help with anything Linda needs during her recovery. Shopping, appointments, household tasks, whatever it takes to help her stay comfortable. At home. My children's expressions clearly showed their frustration with this development. They'd counted on medical professionals supporting their position about the dangers of independent living. Instead, Dr. Wong was essentially endorsing my preference for home recovery with community support. After the doctor left, the room fell silent except for the soft beeping of my monitors. My children regrouped quickly, though their confidence was clearly shaken by the medical contradiction to their plans. We still think assisted living is the safer option, Brian said finally. Even if the doctor thinks home recovery is possible, that doesn't address the long-term issues with the house. What long-term issues? Frank asked. Linda's been maintaining that house beautifully for years. She's not getting any younger, Stephanie replied. What happens when she really can't manage the maintenance? What happens if she falls down those stairs? What happens if she has another medical emergency and no one is around to help? These were legitimate concerns that deserved thoughtful consideration. But my children weren't interested in thoughtful consideration. They were interested in immediate solutions that would eliminate their worry while maximizing their inheritance. The difference was crucial, and Frank seemed to understand it even if my children didn't. Those are all possibilities worth planning for, Frank acknowledged. But they're not certainties that require immediate action. Linda is recovering from successful surgery with an excellent prognosis. She has years of independent living ahead of her if she chooses. You don't know that, Michael said quietly. None of us know what the future holds. He was right, of course. The future was uncertain for all of us, regardless of age or health status. But uncertainty wasn't an excuse for making irreversible decisions based on worst-case scenarios. My children seemed to believe that selling my house and moving me to assisted living would somehow eliminate uncertainty, when all it would really do is eliminate my choices. The conversation continued in circles for another hour, with my children presenting the same arguments and Frank countering with the same logic. I mostly listened, gathering information about their true motivations and the extent of their planning. By lunchtime, several things had become clear. First, my children had already invested significant time and emotional energy in their plan to relocate me. They'd done research, made appointments, and convinced themselves that they were acting in my best interests. Backing down now would require admitting that they'd overstepped their authority and misjudged my capabilities. Second, they genuinely believed that their plan was superior to any alternative I might prefer. They'd decided that assisted living was objectively better than independent living for someone my age, regardless of my personal preferences or actual capabilities. My opinion was less important than their expert analysis of what I needed. Third, they were proceeding with or without my cooperation. The realtor appointment was scheduled, the lawyer consultation was arranged, and the facility tours were planned. They expected me to eventually see the wisdom of their approach and go along willingly, but they were prepared to proceed without my enthusiastic consent. This last realization was the most troubling. I'd raised my children to respect other people's autonomy and to value informed consent in all important decisions. The fact that they were willing to override my clearly expressed wishes suggested that they no longer saw me as a competent adult whose opinions mattered. Frank must have sensed my growing frustration because he squeezed my hand and gave me a meaningful look. Linda, I should probably let you rest. Is there anything you need me to take care of while you're here? His question was clearly code for something more significant than flower watering or mail collection. He was offering to act on my behalf, to begin implementing whatever plans I might have for protecting my interests. The relief of having a trusted ally was overwhelming. Could you check on the house? I asked. Make sure everything is secure. Maybe look over the garden for anything that needs immediate attention? Of course, he replied. I'll take good care of everything until you're back home. The emphasis on until you're back home was subtle but unmistakable. Frank was publicly affirming his expectation that I would return to my own house, not disappear into assisted living. His confidence in my eventual return was exactly what I needed to hear. After he left, my children seemed deflated by the unexpected resistance to their carefully laid plans. They'd anticipated emotional objections from me, but they hadn't expected logical opposition from a knowledgeable ally. Frank's involvement complicated their narrative of a helpless old woman who needed their salvation. He means well, Stephanie said carefully, but Mr. Henderson doesn't understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Actually, Frank understood the situation better than anyone else in the room. He knew my financial resources, my physical capabilities, and my determination to maintain independence. He also knew my children well enough to recognize their tendency to take charge of situations they didn't fully understand. But I didn't correct Stephanie's assumption. Let my children continue underestimating both Frank's knowledge and my resources. Their ignorance was becoming my advantage, and I intended to use every advantage available in the battle ahead. The afternoon brought new developments as my children left to keep their appointments with realtors and lawyers. I was alone for the first time since overhearing their initial conversation, free to think and plan without their constant pressure to accept their decisions. The pain medication made me drowsy, but my mind remained clear enough to consider my options. My children believed they held all the cards in this situation, but they were wrong about that. They had good intentions and legal authority in some areas, but I had resources and relationships they knew nothing about. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they returned with information from their fact-finding missions. They'd probably have market assessments for the house, legal opinions about medical guardianship, and detailed brochures from assisted living facilities. They'd present this information as objective data that supported their predetermined conclusions. But I would be ready for them. Frank would be ready too, armed with information about my actual circumstances and my clearly expressed preferences. My children wanted to manage my life for me, but they were about to discover that Linda Carter wasn't ready to be managed by anyone. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who changed everything. I was picking at the hospital's interpretation of scrambled eggs when a woman in a sharp business suit knocked on my doorframe. She appeared to be in her 40s, with graying blonde hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Mrs. Carter? I'm attorney Susan Blake. Frank Henderson asked me to stop by and see how you're doing." I set down my plastic fork, immediately alert. Susan Blake was one of Riverside's most respected elder law attorneys, someone Frank and I had discussed consulting about estate planning but never quite gotten around to contacting. Her presence here meant Frank had taken my situation more seriously than even I had realized. "Please come in," I said, gesturing to the visitor chair. "Though I should mention my children will be back soon." Frank mentioned that time might be limited, she replied, settling into the chair and opening a leather portfolio. "He's filled me in on the basics of your situation. I wanted to discuss some options while you have privacy to think clearly." Susan's directness was refreshing after 2 days of my children's careful manipulation disguised as concern. She treated me like a competent adult facing a problem that required legal solutions, not like a confused elderly woman who needed protection from my own poor judgment. "What exactly did Frank tell you?" I asked. "That your children are pressuring you to sell your home and move to assisted living against your wishes. That they've scheduled real estate appointments and facility tours without your consent. That they're exploring legal options for medical guardianship." Susan's expression was professionally neutral, but I caught a hint of disapproval in her tone. "Is this accurate?" "Completely accurate," I confirmed. "They've convinced themselves. They're acting in my best interests, but they won't listen when I tell them what my actual interests are." Susan nodded, making notes in her portfolio. "This is unfortunately common after major medical events. Adult children often panic and assume their parents can no longer make sound decisions. Sometimes they're right, but frequently they're not." "My thinking is perfectly clear," I said firmly. "I want to recover in my own home with appropriate support services. I have no interest in assisted living or selling my house." "Frank mentioned that you have significant financial resources your children aren't aware of," Susan continued carefully. "Is that correct?" I hesitated only briefly before nodding. The landscaping business was more successful than we ever advertised. James and I were conservative people who preferred privacy about our finances. After he died, I invested the proceeds from his share of the business. I'm quite comfortable financially. Comfortable enough to afford quality home care services indefinitely? Yes, without touching the principal of my investments. Susan made more notes. That changes the dynamic significantly. Your children are operating under false assumptions about your financial capabilities. They never asked, I pointed out. They assumed that because I live modestly, I must be struggling financially. It was easier to let them think that than to deal with their opinions about how I should spend my money. "A common mistake," Susan agreed. "Financial privacy often backfires when family members make decisions based on incomplete information." We discussed my legal position in detail. Susan explained that as long as I was mentally competent, my children couldn't force me to sell my home or move to assisted living. However, she warned that they could petition for conservatorship if they convinced a court that I was unable to make sound decisions about my welfare. "The fact that you're recovering from major surgery could work against you," she cautioned. "Courts are sometimes sympathetic to family concerns about elderly patients making important decisions while under medical stress. But I'm not making impaired decisions," I protested. I'm simply refusing to go along with decisions my children made without consulting me. I understand that. And frankly, your reasoning seems sound to me. But we need to protect against the possibility that your children might pursue legal guardianship if you continue to resist their plans. Susan outlined several strategies for protecting my autonomy. First, she recommended updating my advance directives to explicitly state my preference for aging in place with support services rather than institutional care. Second, she suggested documenting my mental competency with formal evaluations from my doctors. Third, she proposed creating a revocable trust that would provide clear guidelines for my care while maintaining my control over major decisions. The trust is particularly important, she explained. It demonstrates advanced planning and clear thinking about your future needs. It also provides funding mechanisms for home care services that don't require family involvement or approval. I was fascinated by the legal tools available for protecting personal autonomy. James and I had created basic wills and powers of attorney years ago, but we'd never considered the more sophisticated planning that could prevent well-meaning family interference. How quickly can these documents be prepared? I asked. I can have everything drafted within 48 hours if you decide to proceed. We'd need to meet in person to sign the documents, but I can arrange to come to you once you're discharged from the hospital. The sound of familiar voices in the hallway interrupted our conversation. My children were returning from their morning activities, probably armed with new ammunition for their campaign to relocate me. Susan quickly gathered her papers and handed me a business card. Think about what we've discussed, she said quietly. Frank has my number if you decide you want to proceed. She slipped out just as Brian, Stephanie, and Michael entered, their arms full of folders and their faces bright with the enthusiasm of people who'd accomplished important tasks. They barely noticed Susan leaving, too focused on their own agenda, to pay attention to other visitors. Mom, we have so much to tell you, Stephanie bubbled, pulling her chair close to the bed. The assisted living facilities are absolutely beautiful, much nicer than we expected. And the realtor thinks the house could sell for close to $900,000, Brian added, clearly pleased with this development. The market is incredibly strong right now for vintage homes in good condition. $900,000. The number hung in the air like a banner advertising my displacement. They'd already mentally spent the money, already calculated their inheritance, already planned the liquidation of everything James and I had built together. We met with Golden Years Manor first, Michael said, opening a glossy folder. They have a waiting list, but they think they could have space available within 6 weeks. Perfect timing for your recovery period. 6 weeks. They'd calculated my displacement down to the week, as if my recovery from surgery was simply a logistical challenge to be managed, rather than a personal experience that might affect my preferences and capabilities. The activities coordinator gave us a complete tour, Stephanie continued. They have exercise classes, arts and crafts, movie nights, even day trips to local attractions. You'd have built-in social activities and friendship opportunities. Built-in social activities sounded like a prison sentence to me. I'd spent my adult life choosing my own activities, pursuing my own interests, developing friendships based on shared values rather than shared housing arrangements. The idea of scheduled socialization was profoundly depressing. What about the garden? I asked. Is there space for me to continue gardening? My children exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared opinion that gardening was no longer a realistic expectation for someone my age. There's a beautiful courtyard with professional landscaping, Brian said carefully. Very low maintenance, perfect for someone who doesn't want to worry about upkeep anymore. Professional landscaping meant plants chosen for durability rather than beauty, arranged for visual impact rather than ecological function, maintained by strangers who had no emotional connection to the growing things they tended. It was the antithesis of everything I loved about gardening. I don't want low maintenance, I said. I want my own garden where I can choose what to plant and how to care for it. Mom, you just had major heart surgery, Michael said gently. Gardening is physically demanding work. Digging, lifting, bending, all of that strain on your cardiovascular system. Gardening is also excellent rehabilitation exercise, I countered. Gentle physical activity, fresh air, purposeful movement, stress reduction. My cardiologist will probably recommend it as part of my recovery program. This clearly wasn't the response they'd expected. They'd assumed I would be grateful for their research and planning, appreciative of their efforts to solve my housing problem before it became a crisis. My continued resistance to their solutions was obviously frustrating. We also met with Attorney Davidson about the legal aspects, Brian said, changing tactics. He explained the process for medical power of attorney if you become unable to make decisions for yourself. Medical power of attorney was different from the general conservatorship Susan had warned me about, but it was still a mechanism for transferring my decision-making authority to my children. The fact that they were already consulting lawyers about my future incompetence was deeply unsettling. I'm perfectly capable of making my own medical decisions, I said sharply. Yesterday, today, and for the foreseeable future. Of course you are right now, Stephanie soothed, but the lawyer explained that it's important to have these arrangements in place before they're needed. Just good planning. Good planning from their perspective, perhaps. From my perspective, it looked like preparation for a hostile takeover of my life. They were systematically removing my choices and options, while assuring me it was all for my own good. The lawyer also mentioned that the house sale would need to be handled carefully for tax purposes, Brian continued. Something about capital gains calculations and timing the sale to minimize your tax burden. More evidence that they'd moved far beyond exploring options into active planning for predetermined outcomes. They weren't asking whether I wanted to sell the house. They were figuring out how to sell it most advantageously. The distinction was crucial and telling. A knock on the door interrupted their presentation. Dr. Wong entered with her usual brisk efficiency, clipboard in hand, and a no-nonsense expression that suggested she had other patients to see and limited time for family conferences. Good morning, Mrs. Carter. How are you feeling today? Much better, I replied honestly. Stronger, more alert, less pain. Excellent. Your recovery is progressing exactly as expected. I think we can plan on discharge tomorrow morning if tonight goes well. Tomorrow morning, freedom from this hospital bed, from the constant monitoring, from the captive audience situation that had allowed my children to present their plans without interruption or escape. Doctor, Brian interjected, we're concerned about Mom's discharge. Planning. Her house isn't really suitable for someone recovering from heart surgery. Dr. Wong turned to me with a questioning look. What are your concerns about going home, Mrs. Carter? I have no concerns, I said clearly. I want to go home to my own house. I have friends who will help with anything I can't manage myself. The house has stairs, Stephanie added quickly, and she'll be alone most of the time. We think assisted living would be safer during the recovery period. Many patients successfully recover at home, Dr. Wong replied. The key is adequate support and realistic expectations about activity levels. Mrs. Carter, do you have someone who can stay with you for the first few days? Before I could answer, Frank's voice came from the doorway. I'll be staying in the guest room for as long as Linda needs help. Relief flooded through me at the sight of his familiar face and the sound of his confident assertion. Frank had clearly been listening to the conversation and timed his entrance perfectly to counter my children's concerns about my safety at home. Mr. Henderson, Dr. Wong acknowledged with a professional nod. That's excellent. Having someone available for the first week or two makes home recovery much safer and more comfortable. My children's expressions shifted from confidence to frustration as their primary argument against home recovery evaporated. They'd counted on my isolation as proof that assisted living was the only viable option. Frank's offer of live-in support eliminated that justification. "Frank, that's very generous," Brian said tightly, "but we can't expect you to put your life on hold to provide nursing care." "I'm not providing nursing care," Frank replied calmly. "I'm providing companionship and assistance with daily activities that Linda can't manage alone initially. Grocery shopping, meal preparation, transportation to appointments, basic support that any good friend would offer." "But what if there's a medical emergency?" Stephanie pressed. "What if she has complications?" "Then I'll call 911 just like anyone would in an emergency situation," Frank said. "Linda will have all her medications, a list of warning signs to watch for, and follow-up appointments with her cardiologist. She's not moving to the wilderness. She's going home to a house 5 minutes from the hospital." Dr. Wong nodded approvingly. "That sounds like an excellent discharge plan. Mrs. Carter will have support when she needs it, and independence when she doesn't. Many patients do better in familiar surroundings with people they trust." The medical endorsement of home recovery with Frank's support clearly derailed my children's carefully constructed argument about safety and medical supervision. They regrouped quickly, but their confidence was visibly shaken. "We're still concerned about the long-term picture," Michael said. "Even if home recovery is possible, the house will eventually become too much for Mom to handle." "Eventually is not today," Frank pointed out. "Linda is recovering from successful surgery with an excellent prognosis. Why create solutions for problems that may never materialize?" It was exactly the right question, and one my children couldn't answer honestly. The truth was that they wanted immediate solutions because uncertainty made them uncomfortable. They preferred the illusion of control that came with making irreversible decisions rather than the anxiety of waiting to see how my recovery progressed. "Because the real estate market won't wait," Brian said finally. "Spring is the best time to sell, and if we wait until fall, we could lose significant value." There it was. The real motivation behind their urgency. Not my health, not my safety, not my preferences, but their concern about maximizing the financial return on my house sale. The market timing was more important than my recovery timing. "I'm not selling my house," I said quietly but firmly. "Not in the spring, not in the fall, not ever. That house is my home, and I intend to live in it for many more years." The silence that followed was deafening. My children stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to take up skydiving or join a motorcycle gang. My clear statement of my preferences apparently came as a complete shock to them. "Mom," Stephanie said carefully, "you're not thinking clearly about this. The house is a huge responsibility, and you're not getting any younger." "My thinking is perfectly clear," I replied. "Clearer than it's been in months, actually. Major surgery has a way of clarifying what's truly important." "But the money from the sale would give you security," Brian argued. "You could live comfortably without worrying about house payments, property taxes, maintenance costs." "I already live comfortably without worrying about those expenses," I said. "The house is paid off, I have excellent insurance, and I can afford maintenance and improvements indefinitely." This was news to my children, who'd assumed I was financially stretched by homeownership expenses. Their shocked expressions showed they'd never considered the possibility that I might be more financially secure than they realized. "You never mentioned having significant savings," Michael said slowly. "You never asked," I replied. "You assumed I was struggling financially because it fit your narrative about my need for your intervention." Frank was watching this exchange with obvious satisfaction. He'd known this moment would come when my children's assumptions collided with reality. Their careful plans were built on faulty foundations, and the truth was undermining everything they'd worked to arrange. "How much money are we talking about?" Brian asked bluntly. "Enough," I said simply. "Enough to live exactly as I choose for the rest of my life." The conversation took on a different tone after that revelation. My children had to recalibrate their approach now that financial necessity was no longer a justification for their plans. They'd presented assisted living as a practical solution to my presumed poverty, but that argument collapsed when poverty wasn't actually a factor. Even if money isn't an issue, Stephanie said, regrouping quickly, there are still safety concerns about living alone in a large house. She won't be living alone, Frank reminded her. I'll be there as long as she wants company. But Frank, you have your own life, your own responsibilities, Michael protested. You can't become Mom's full-time caregiver. Frank smiled at the suggestion that helping me would be a burden. Linda and I have been friends for over 30 years. James was my best friend and business partner. Taking care of his wife isn't a sacrifice. It's an honor. The depth of Frank's commitment was clearly unexpected. My children had dismissed him as a well-meaning neighbor who might help occasionally with yard work or grocery shopping. They hadn't anticipated that he would offer comprehensive, long-term support for my independence. Dr. Wong had been listening to this family discussion with the patience of someone who'd witnessed similar conversations many times before. Finally, she intervened with the authority of medical expertise. Mrs. Carter, you have the right to make your own decisions about where and how you want to recover. Your cognitive function is excellent, your judgment appears sound, and your support system is adequate. I see no medical reason why you shouldn't go home tomorrow as planned. Her words carried the weight of professional assessment that my children couldn't easily challenge. They might question my judgment or Frank's capabilities, but contradicting my doctor's medical opinion would be much more difficult. After Dr. Wong left, my children sat in stunned silence. Their carefully orchestrated campaign had encountered unexpected resistance at every turn. The medical establishment supported home recovery. I had financial resources they hadn't known about. Frank was offering comprehensive support, and I was proving far more determined than they'd anticipated. We need to talk privately, Brian A. said finally, gesturing to his siblings, as a family. They filed out of my room like a defeated army retreating to plan new strategies. I watched them go with a mixture of sadness and determination. These were my children, people I loved deeply, but they'd forgotten that love didn't give them the right to control my life. Frank pulled his chair closer to my bed once we were alone. You handled that perfectly, he said with obvious admiration. They weren't expecting you to fight back so effectively. I learned from the best, I replied, thinking of James and the countless business negotiations we'd navigated together. Never show all your cards at once, and always keep your opponents guessing about your real capabilities. Frank laughed. Your husband would be proud of how you're handling this. He always said you were the stronger one in your partnership. We were both strong in different ways, I corrected. But yes, I think he would approve of my refusal to be managed by well-meaning children who think they know better than I do about my own life. We spent the next hour discussing practical arrangements for my homecoming. Frank had already prepared the guest room and stocked the kitchen with easy-to-prepare meals. He'd arranged for a local home health service to provide physical therapy sessions and had researched meal delivery options for times when cooking felt too demanding. Most importantly, he'd contacted Susan Blake about expediting the legal documents that would protect my autonomy going forward. The trust arrangements, updated advance directives, and formal competency evaluations would provide legal armor against any future attempts to override my decisions. Your children mean well, Frank said carefully, but they've forgotten that good intentions don't justify taking away someone's choices. They're scared, I replied, feeling generous toward my misguided offspring. They love me and want to protect me, but they're confusing protection with control. The question is whether they can learn the difference before they damage your relationship permanently. It was a sobering thought. My children's campaign to relocate me was driven by love and concern, but it was also profoundly disrespectful of my autonomy and judgment. If they continued to pursue guardianship or other legal interventions, Our relationship might never recover from the betrayal. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, I was going home to my own house, my own garden, my own life. My children would have to decide whether they could accept my choices or whether they preferred to continue fighting a battle they couldn't win. The afternoon brought a parade of nurses with discharge instructions, prescriptions to fill, and follow-up appointments to schedule. Each interaction reinforced my confidence in my decision to recover at home. I was alert, mobile, and capable of managing my own care with appropriate support. My children returned as dinner was being served, their expressions showing the strain of their private family conference. They'd clearly spent hours trying to develop new strategies for overcoming my resistance to their plans. "We've been talking," Stephanie began carefully, "and we want you to know that we support whatever decision makes you happiest." The phrasing was diplomatic, but I caught the subtle implication that my happiness was the only consideration, not my judgment or my rights. They were repositioning their campaign as emotional support rather than practical intervention. "We still think assisted living would be safer and more comfortable," Brian added. "But if you're determined to go home, we'll help make that work." Their newfound cooperation felt conditional, as if they were agreeing to humor my preferences, while waiting for me to come to my senses. But conditional cooperation was better than open warfare, so I accepted their offer graciously. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate your willingness to support my choice, even if you don't agree with it. We just want you to be happy and healthy," Michael said, though his tone suggested he still doubted that home recovery could achieve either goal. "Then we want the same thing," I replied, "because I'll be happiest and healthiest in my own home, surrounded by my own things, living according to my own preferences." The conversation remained superficially pleasant for the rest of the evening, but I could sense their continued frustration beneath the surface. They'd invested too much time and emotion in their original plan to abandon it easily. This felt like a strategic retreat rather than genuine acceptance of my decision. But I was too tired to analyze their motivations further. Tomorrow would bring the freedom of my own home, my own bed, my own kitchen. Tomorrow would begin the next phase of this family drama, but tonight I would rest in the knowledge that I'd successfully defended my first line of autonomy. My children thought they were protecting a fragile old woman who needed their guidance. Instead, they'd awakened a fierce defender of her own independence who had no intention of surrendering control of her life to anyone, no matter how good their intentions might be. Coming home felt like emerging from an alternate reality where other people made decisions about my life. Frank helped me from his car to the front porch, where my roses were blooming in glorious defiance of my children's predictions of decay and neglect. The Victorian stood exactly as I'd left it 4 days ago, solid and welcoming, its wraparound porch decorated with the hanging baskets of fuchsias I'd planted in early spring. "Everything looks perfect," I said, breathing in the familiar scent of jasmine and honeysuckle that climbed the porch columns. "Better than perfect." Frank smiled as he unlocked the front door with the key I'd given him years ago. "Mrs. Patterson has been keeping an eye on things. She watered your plants and brought in your mail. I think she's been watching for us from her kitchen window." As if summoned by his words, my elderly neighbor appeared on her own front porch, waving enthusiastically. Dorothy Patterson was 82 years old, sharp as a tack, and had lived next door for over 40 years. She'd been my closest confidant during James's illness and my strongest supporter after his death. "Linda Carter, you look wonderful," she called across the yard, much too healthy for someone who's supposed to be at death's door. I laughed, recognizing Dorothy's dry commentary on my children's dramatic assessments of my condition. News traveled fast in our neighborhood, and Dorothy had undoubtedly heard about the assisted living plans through the local gossip network. "Come over for coffee once you're settled," she continued. "I have some interesting news about your recent visitors." Visitors? That was intriguing. My children had supposedly been at the house yesterday for the realtor appointment, but perhaps there had been other developments I wasn't aware of. Dorothy missed nothing that happened on our street, and her intelligence reports were usually more accurate than official sources. Inside the house, everything was exactly as I'd left it, yet somehow more precious for having been temporarily threatened. The gleaming hardwood floors James and I had refinished ourselves, the crown molding we'd painstakingly restored, the built-in bookcases where I'd displayed decades of family photographs. This wasn't just a house, it was the physical manifestation of a life well lived. Frank had indeed prepared thoroughly for my homecoming. The guest room was ready with fresh linens and a small vase of roses from my garden. The kitchen was stocked with easy-to-prepare meals, fresh fruit, and the herbal teas my cardiologist had recommended. A pill organizer sat on the counter with my medications sorted by day and time, eliminating any excuse my children might have about my inability to manage my own prescriptions. "You've thought of everything," I said gratefully, as Frank showed me the modifications he'd made for my comfort. A shower chair in the main bathroom, a temporary ramp over the front steps, handrails, installed along the staircase to the second floor. Small accommodations that preserved my independence while acknowledging my temporary limitations. "James would have done the same for me," Frank replied simply. "We take care of each other. That's what friends do." The contrast between Frank's approach and my children's couldn't have been sharper. Frank had found ways to help me maintain my autonomy while addressing legitimate safety concerns. My children had proposed eliminating my autonomy entirely to address theoretical future problems. Both approaches showed love and concern, but only one respected my dignity and personal agency. I spent the afternoon reacquainting myself with my own space, moving slowly but confidently through rooms that had been my sanctuary for nearly 3 decades. The physical therapy exercises Dr. Wong had prescribed were easily accomplished using my own furniture and hallways. The stairs were manageable with the new handrails, though I planned to use the downstairs powder room for the first few weeks, to minimize unnecessary climbing. Everything my children had characterized as impossible or dangerous was proving to be perfectly manageable with minor adaptations. Their dire predictions about my inability to function at home seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang with a call from Brian. His tone was carefully neutral, the voice of someone trying to maintain diplomatic relations despite fundamental disagreements. "Mom, how are you feeling? How was the trip home?" "Wonderful," I replied honestly. "It's so good to be back in my own space." "That's great. Frank taking good care of you?" "Excellent care. He's been incredibly thoughtful about everything." A pause. Brian was clearly struggling with how to address what came next. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened yesterday with the realtor." Yesterday, while I'd been in the hospital defending my decision to come home, my children had apparently proceeded with their real estate evaluation despite my clear opposition to selling the house. The audacity was breathtaking. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite my rising anger. "Well, Sandra Martinez came by as scheduled to assess the property value. She spent about 2 hours going through the house and grounds, taking photos, making notes. Very thorough evaluation. I told you I have no interest in selling the house." "I know, but we thought it would be good to have the information anyway, just in case circumstances change and you decide to consider other options." "Just in case I came to my senses," he meant. Just in case I eventually saw the wisdom of their approach and agreed to relocate voluntarily. They were keeping all their options open while hoping I would eventually capitulate to their superior judgment. "What did she say?" I asked, curious despite my irritation. "The house is in excellent condition, much better than most properties its age. She was impressed by the restoration work and the garden. She thinks it would sell quickly in the current market." "For how much?" "Her preliminary estimate is between $850,000 and $950,000, depending on buyer interest and timing." Nearly $1 million. The number represented almost 30 years of our lives, countless hours of labor, decades of love invested in wood and stone and growing things. To my children, it was simply a large number that could be divided 3 ways to solve their various financial challenges. That's very interesting, I said calmly. But since I'm not selling, the market value is purely academic information. Another pause. Mom, Sandra also mentioned some potential issues that could affect the value if we wait too long to sell. Here it came. The new strategy for pressuring me to accept their timeline rather than my own preferences. Instead of medical emergencies and safety concerns, they were now focusing on market conditions and property maintenance issues. What kind of issues? The roof will need replacement within the next 5 years. The heating system is nearing the end of its useful life. The electrical panel should be updated to meet current codes. Normal maintenance for a house this age, but expensive maintenance. Everything Brian mentioned was accurate. James and I had been aware of these upcoming expenses and had budgeted for them accordingly. The roof replacement alone would cost $30,000, a significant expense that could seem overwhelming to someone on a fixed income. But I wasn't on a fixed income, and $30,000 was less than 1% of my total assets. The heating system, electrical work, and other maintenance projects were well within my financial capabilities. My children's concern about these expenses only made sense if they assumed I couldn't afford them. Those are all manageable expenses, I said. I've been planning for them for years. But Mom, you're talking about $100,000 or more in maintenance costs over the next few years. Wouldn't it make more sense to sell now while the house is in good condition and let someone else deal with those expenses? The logic was seductive if you valued money over meaning, efficiency over emotion, practical considerations over personal attachment. From Brian's perspective, it probably seemed irrational to spend money maintaining a house when I could sell it for a substantial profit and move somewhere with no maintenance responsibilities. But houses weren't just financial assets to be optimized for maximum return. This house was my history, my sanctuary, my connection to James and the life we'd built together. No amount of money could replace what I would lose by selling it. I'd rather spend money maintaining my own home than pay rent to live in someone else's institutional housing, I replied. At least my maintenance investments will benefit me directly. But the assisted living facility takes care of everything. No property taxes, no utility bills, no repair costs, no yard work. You could just focus on enjoying your retirement without all the homeownership stress. Homeownership stress. As if caring for my home was a burden rather than a source of purpose and satisfaction. Brian had never understood the deep pleasure I found in tending my garden, maintaining my house, being responsible for my own space. He saw only the work and expense, not the meaning and fulfillment. I don't want someone else taking care of everything, I explained patiently. I want to take care of my own things in my own way for as long as I'm able. But what happens when you're not able anymore? What happens when the maintenance becomes too much? What happens when you can't afford the expenses on a fixed income? The same questions again, variations on the theme of my inevitable decline and incapacity. My children seemed convinced that aging was a straight line toward dependency and that planning for the future meant preparing for the worst possible outcomes. When and if that time comes, I'll deal with it then, I said. I won't make major life changes based on problems that might never occur. But Mom, Brian's voice took on the patient tone he'd used since childhood when explaining something. He thought I didn't understand. The real estate market won't wait for you to be ready. If you wait until you can't maintain the house anymore, you'll be selling at a disadvantage. Distressed sale, possible damage to the property, pressure to accept lower offers. Again, market timing seemed more important to him than my personal timeline. He was asking me to make irreversible decisions based on optimal financial conditions, rather than my own readiness to change my living situation. Brian, I appreciate your concern about my financial welfare, but I'm not making decisions based on real estate market conditions. I'm making decisions based on where I want to live and how I want to spend my remaining years. The conversation continued in circles for another 20 minutes, with Brian presenting logical arguments for selling and me explaining why logic wasn't the only relevant factor in personal decisions. Finally, we reached the impasse that had been inevitable from the beginning. "I guess we'll have to agree to disagree," he said with obvious frustration. "But I want you to know that if you change your mind, we're here to help with whatever you need." After hanging up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the belongings my children wanted to liquidate or donate. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every decorative object had a story and a meaning that would be lost in their systematic dismantling of my life. How could I explain the emotional value of items that appeared to have only monetary worth? Frank emerged from the kitchen, where he'd been tactfully absent during my phone conversation. "Rough call?" "They had the realtor over yesterday while I was in the hospital," I said. "Got a market assessment, identified maintenance issues, calculated my inability to afford upkeep on a fixed income." Frank's eyebrows rose. "They're not giving up easily." "No, they're not. And they're operating under false assumptions about my financial situation that make their arguments seem reasonable. Maybe it's time to correct those assumptions." I considered his suggestion. My children's entire campaign was based on their belief that I was financially vulnerable and unable to afford independent living. If I revealed my true financial position, it would eliminate their practical justifications for relocating me. But it would also open new cans of worms. Questions about why I'd hidden my wealth, demands for explanations about my financial planning, expectations about their inheritance that might create different but equally problematic pressures. Not yet, I decided. Let them continue making assumptions. Their ignorance is becoming an advantage. Frank nodded approvingly. "Your husband always said the best strategy was to let your opponents defeat themselves through overconfidence." That evening brought an unexpected visit from Dorothy Patterson, who appeared at my kitchen door with a plate of homemade cookies and a gleam in her eyes that suggested interesting gossip was forthcoming. "Welcome home, dear," she said, settling into the chair where James used to read his morning newspaper. "You look much too lively for someone whose children are planning her funeral." "Is that what they're saying?" I asked, amused by Dorothy's characteristic bluntness. "Not exactly, but close enough. Your Brian was at my door yesterday afternoon asking about my experiences with assisted living. Wanted to know if I'd ever considered moving to a facility with medical staff and organized activities." "What did you tell him?" Dorothy's smile was wicked. "I told him I'd rather die in my own home than live in some institutional warehouse for old people. Suggested he might want to consider his mother's actual preferences before making plans for her future." "How did he respond to that?" "Not well. Started explaining why assisted living was objectively better than independent living for someone your age. Lots of statistics about fall prevention and medical emergencies. Very condescending tone, as if I couldn't understand basic concepts about aging." Dorothy was sharper than most people half her age, with a master's degree in education and 40 years of experience managing challenging students and demanding parents. Brian's mistake in underestimating her intelligence was typical of his approach to anyone over 65. "But here's the interesting part," Dorothy continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "After he left, I saw him talking on his phone in his car for over an hour. Very animated conversation, lots of gesturing. Then this morning, a different realtor showed up." "A different realtor?" "Not the woman who was here yesterday. This was a man, older, more expensive-looking suit. He spent about an hour walking around your property, taking photos, making phone calls. Had clipboard with official-looking documents." This was unexpected and concerning. Why would my children have a second realtor evaluate the property? Was it standard practice to get multiple opinions, or was something else happening? Did you happen to catch his name or company? Dorothy pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket. I happened to be getting my mail when he was loading his car. Maxwell Properties, James Maxwell, senior partner. Big commercial real estate firm downtown. Commercial real estate. That was distinctly different from residential sales, which was Sandra Martinez's specialty. Why would my children need a commercial assessment of my house? Dorothy, did this man seem to be evaluating the house itself or the entire property? That's what was odd about it. He spent more time looking at the lot lines and measuring distances than examining the house. Very interested in the size of the property, access to the street, parking potential. Almost like he was considering it for development rather than residential sale. A chill ran down my spine as the implications became clear. My house sat on a large corner lot in a neighborhood that was becoming increasingly desirable for commercial development. The property was zoned residential, but zoning could be changed with the right applications and enough political pressure. If my children were exploring commercial development options, they weren't just planning to sell my house. They were planning to destroy it, to tear down everything James and I had built and replace it with something that would maximize profit regardless of historical or emotional value. Frank, I called, and he appeared immediately from the living room where he'd been reading. We need to call Susan Blake. Tonight. I explained Dorothy's observations about the commercial realtor and my growing suspicions about my children's true intentions. Frank's expression darkened as he absorbed the implications. If they're serious about commercial development, they'll need your consent or legal guardianship to proceed, he said. The property is still in your name, right? Yes, though they've been pressuring me to transfer it to them for estate planning purposes. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. They've been laying groundwork for this for months, haven't they? All the talk about simplifying my affairs, reducing my responsibilities, making things easier for everyone. Frank was already dialing Susan's emergency number. If they get guardianship, they could make all property decisions on your behalf, including selling to developers who would tear down the house. The thought of bulldozers destroying my home, my garden, my sanctuary, was almost physically painful. Every tree James and I had planted, every improvement we'd made, every memory embedded in wood and stone would be erased to make room for strip malls or condominiums. Susan answered on the second ring, her professional demeanor intact despite the late hour. Frank explained the situation while I provided details about the commercial assessment and my children's increasing pressure for property transfers. This changes everything, she said bluntly. If they're exploring development options, they're not just concerned about your welfare. They're positioning to maximize profit from your property regardless of your wishes. What can we do to protect the house? Several things, but we need to move quickly. First, I'll prepare a property protection trust that prevents sale or development without your explicit consent, even if you become incapacitated. Second, we'll update your will to include specific instructions about preserving the house. Third, we'll document your mental competency with formal evaluations that will make guardianship proceedings much more difficult. How quickly can you have the documents ready? I'll work through the night if necessary. This is exactly the kind of situation these protections are designed to prevent. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table feeling betrayed in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd known my children wanted me to move to assisted living, but I'd assumed their motivations were genuine concern for my welfare mixed with practical considerations about inheritance. The commercial development angle suggested something much more calculating. They weren't just trying to protect a vulnerable elderly mother. They were positioning to maximize the financial return on my property by any means necessary. I raised them better than this, I said to Frank, feeling the deep sadness that comes with discovering your children aren't who you thought they were. You raised them to be successful and ambitious, Frank replied gently. Sometimes those qualities can override other values when large amounts of money are involved. But this is my home, the place where I raised them, where their father and I built our life together. How can they even consider destroying it for profit? Because they see it as your former home, Frank said. In their minds, you're already gone, already relocated to assisted living. The house is just an asset to be optimized, not a living sanctuary that still matters to you. The realization was devastating but accurate. My children had mentally moved me out of my own life, relegating me to the role of elderly dependent, whose preferences were less important than practical considerations. They'd convinced themselves that assisted living was inevitable, which made the house's destruction acceptable collateral damage. But I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was my house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as my children discovered that their commercial development plans would face unexpected legal obstacles. They thought they were managing a helpless old woman's affairs, but they were about to encounter the full force of a property owner who had no intention of surrendering her rights to anyone. The battle for my independence had escalated into a battle for my home's very existence. My children had underestimated my determination to protect what mattered most to me. They were about to learn that some things weren't for sale at any price. As I prepared for bed in my own house for the first time in a week, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had brought both homecoming and discovery, comfort and alarm. But underlying everything was a steely resolve that surprised me with its intensity. I'd spent too many years building this life to watch my own children tear it down for profit. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one from someone who had more resources, more allies, and more motivation than they could possibly imagine. The heart surgery had been meant to give me more years of life. Now I knew exactly how I intended to spend them, defending everything I'd worked to create against people who should have been protecting it with me. My children thought they were saving me from myself. Instead, they'd awakened a fierce protector who would stop at nothing to preserve what truly mattered. The real battle was just beginning. The confrontation came sooner than expected. I was enjoying my morning coffee in the garden, watching Frank deadhead roses and marveling at how normal everything felt, when all three of my children arrived unannounced. Their coordinated arrival suggested another family strategy session, and their serious expressions confirmed that this wasn't a casual wellness check. "Mom, we need to have a family meeting," Brian announced without preamble, settling into the patio chair across from me as if he were calling a board meeting. "There are some important matters we need to discuss." Stephanie and Michael flanked him, creating a semicircle that felt distinctly like an intervention. They'd brought folders. Again, but these looked different from the assisted living brochures and real estate assessments. These were legal documents, official papers that suggested they'd moved beyond planning into implementation. "What kind of matters?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Financial planning, legal protections, and some exciting opportunities that have come up regarding the property," Stephanie said with forced enthusiasm. "We've been working with some professionals to explore all your options." Options they'd explored without consulting me, presented as if they were gifts rather than decisions they'd made unilaterally about my future. Frank straightened from his rose pruning, alert to the tension in the air. "Would you like me to give you privacy for your family discussion?" "Actually, Mr. Henderson, this concerns you too," Brian said with a meaningful look. "We need to talk about the living arrangements here." I set down my coffee cup carefully, recognizing the opening move in what would undoubtedly be their final assault on my independence. They'd gathered their ammunition, rehearsed their arguments, and chosen their battlefield. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing too. "Please go ahead," I said calmly. "I'm listening." Brian opened his folder and extracted a thick document with multiple colored tabs marking different sections. "We've been consulting with financial advisors and elder law attorneys about the best way to protect your assets and ensure your long-term security." "I appreciate your concern," I replied. But I already have financial advisors and an attorney. I'm quite comfortable with my current arrangements. Mom, with respect, your current arrangements aren't adequate. For someone in your situation, Michael said gently, the house alone represents a massive concentration of wealth that should be diversified for your protection. Diversified. Financial jargon that disguise their real objective of liquefying my assets for easier management and distribution. They wanted to convert my home from a physical sanctuary into numbers on a portfolio statement. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Stephanie leaned forward eagerly. We've found an incredible opportunity to maximize the value of this property while providing you with guaranteed income for life. A development company is interested in purchasing the land for a mixed-use project that would include senior housing, retail space, and medical offices. Mixed-use development. The commercial realtor Dorothy had spotted was part of a larger scheme to transform my neighborhood from residential to commercial. My house wasn't just being sold, it was being sacrificed for urban development. They're offering significantly more than residential value, Brian added, sliding a document across the table. $1.2 million for the property, plus a guaranteed apartment in the new senior housing complex. You'd have equity, income, and housing all secured in one transaction. The number was impressive, I had to admit. 40%. More than the residential estimates, enough to tempt anyone who viewed property purely as investment rather than home. But the apartment in the senior housing complex was clearly their solution to my continued resistance to assisted living. Let me understand this correctly, I said slowly. You want me to sell my home to developers who will tear it down and build a commercial complex, then move me into an apartment in the senior housing portion of that complex? It's perfect, Stephanie said with genuine excitement. You'd have guaranteed housing, medical facilities on site, and substantial financial security. Plus, you'd be contributing to neighborhood revitalization and creating housing for other seniors. Neighborhood revitalization. As if my historic Victorian and its carefully tended gardens were blights that needed replacing with modern efficiency. As if decades of preservation and restoration were obstacles to progress, rather than valuable contributions to community character. What happens to my garden? I asked. My children exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared opinion, that gardens were dispensable luxuries for someone my age. The complex will have professionally maintained landscaping, Michael said carefully. Beautiful courtyards and common areas designed for low maintenance and universal accessibility. That's not what I asked. What happens to my specific garden? The roses James and I planted, the fruit trees we chose together, the vegetable beds where I've been growing food for 30 years? Silence. Because of course my specific garden would be bulldozed along with everything else to make room for parking lots and commercial space. The developers might include some decorative plantings, but nothing that connected to my history or reflected my personal choices. Mom, you can't take a garden with you when you move to assisted living anyway, Brian pointed out with ruthless logic. At least this way, you'd get substantial compensation for giving it up. The casual dismissal of something that brought me daily joy and spiritual nourishment was breathtaking. My garden wasn't just a collection of plants, it was my connection to the natural world, my creative expression, my meditation and exercise and purposeful activity all combined. I'm not moving to assisted living, I said firmly. I've told you repeatedly that I intend to stay in my own home. But Mom, be realistic, Stephanie pleaded. Even if you could manage the house now, what about 5 years from now? 10 years? You can't maintain this property indefinitely. And what happens when the development is complete and you decide you want to move somewhere else? I asked. Senior housing apartments aren't exactly portable or liquid assets. Frank had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. Now he stepped closer to our seating area, his presence a reminder that I had allies my children continued to underestimate. "Have you considered that Linda might not want to live in a commercial development?" he asked mildly. "That she might prefer to maintain her current lifestyle in a residential neighborhood?" "Mr. Henderson, with respect, this really is a family matter," Brian replied coolly. "We're talking about Mom's long-term financial security and healthcare needs. I'm talking about Linda's right to make her own decisions about where and how she wants to live," Frank countered, "which seems to be missing from your calculations." The tension escalated as my children realized they were facing organized resistance rather than confused reluctance. Brian's professional composure cracked slightly as he recognized that Frank wasn't going to be dismissed or intimidated. "Look, the opportunity won't wait indefinitely," Brian said, returning his attention to me. "The developers need a decision within 30 days, or they'll look at other properties. This is the best offer we're likely to see." 30 days. They'd committed me to a timeline without my knowledge or consent, creating artificial urgency to pressure me into accepting their predetermined solution. The manipulation was becoming increasingly blatant. "I don't recall authorizing anyone to negotiate on my behalf," I said quietly. "Who exactly made commitments to developers about my property?" Another uncomfortable silence. Because of course they'd been discussing my property as if they already controlled it, making provisional agreements based on their assumption that I would eventually see reason and cooperate with their plans. "We didn't make any binding commitments," Michael said quickly. "We just explored options so we could present you with complete information." "You explored options that require destroying my home," I corrected. "Options that eliminate everything I value about my current life. How is that exploring my options?" Stephanie tried a different approach, opening her folder to reveal financial projections and actuarial tables. "Mom, let's talk about the numbers. Even if you could afford to maintain this house indefinitely, which is questionable on Social Security and pension income, it doesn't make financial sense." Social Security and pension income. They were still operating under completely false assumptions about my financial situation. Their entire argument was based on the belief that I was living on fixed income with limited resources. "What if I told you that my financial situation is significantly different from what you've assumed?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Brian's voice sharpened with sudden attention. Frank and I exchanged glances. This was the moment I'd been avoiding, but circumstances were forcing the revelation. My children's ignorance about my financial capabilities was driving increasingly desperate measures to solve problems that didn't actually exist. "I mean that I'm not financially vulnerable or dependent on Social Security for my basic needs," I said clearly. "The landscaping business was more successful than your father and I ever discussed publicly. When he died, I invested his share of the sale proceeds. I have significant assets that make all your concerns about property maintenance and care costs irrelevant." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. My children stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion to dawning comprehension. "How significant?" Brian asked bluntly. "Significant enough to live exactly as I choose for the rest of my life without depending on anyone else for financial support." "Are we talking about hundreds of thousands?" Stephanie pressed. "We're talking about enough," I replied. "More than enough to maintain this house, hire any care I might need, and still leave substantial inheritances for all of you when the time comes." The transformation in their expressions was fascinating to watch. Confusion gave way to calculation as they absorbed the implications of my revelation. If I wasn't financially vulnerable, their entire justification for relocating me collapsed. But instead of relief or apology, I saw something else in their faces. Disappointment, perhaps even anger, that I'd allowed them to worry unnecessarily about my financial security, as if my privacy about money was somehow a betrayal of their concern. "Why didn't you tell us?" Michael asked, his voice tight with Emotion, we've been worried sick about how you'd manage financially. Because you never asked about my actual financial situation, I replied. You made assumptions and built plans based on those assumptions without ever consulting me about the reality. But if you have money, why are you living so modestly? Stephanie demanded. Why drive an old car? Why shop at discount stores? Why worry about utility bills? Because I choose to live modestly, I said simply. Having money doesn't mean I need to spend it ostentatiously or change my lifestyle to impress other people. Brian was clearly struggling to recalibrate his approach now that financial necessity was no longer a factor. Even if money isn't an issue, the practical concerns about maintaining this house still apply. It's still too much work for someone your age. According to whom? Frank interjected. Linda's been maintaining this property beautifully for years. She's in excellent health, she's recovering well from surgery, and she has friends willing to help with anything she can't manage alone. But for how long? Brian shot back. What happens when she's 80, 85, 90? Are you planning to take care of her indefinitely? The question revealed Brian's real concern, which wasn't my current capabilities, but his anxiety about future responsibilities. He wanted me safely warehoused in assisted living not because I needed it now, but because it would eliminate his worry about what might happen later. I'm planning to be Linda's friend for as long as she wants my friendship, Frank replied steadily. Just like I was James's friend for 30 years. That's what friendship means. You can't guarantee that, Stephanie protested. You're not young yourself. What happens if you get sick, or die, or can't help anymore? Then Linda will make other arrangements based on her actual needs at that time, Frank said. She's a competent adult who's been solving problems for decades. Why would you assume she'd suddenly become helpless? It was exactly the right question, and one my children couldn't answer honestly. Their assumptions about my inevitable decline were based on ageist stereotypes, rather than realistic assessments of my actual capabilities and resources. The conversation devolved into a circular argument about theoretical future problems versus present realities. My children continued to insist that proactive planning required accepting worst-case scenarios, while Frank and I argued for dealing with actual challenges as they arose. Finally, Brian played what he clearly considered his trump card. Mom, we've already consulted with attorneys about medical guardianship procedures. If you're not capable of making sound decisions about your welfare, the court can appoint someone to make those decisions for you. The threat was unmistakable. If I continued to resist their plans, they were prepared to have me declared legally incompetent and stripped of my decision-making authority. The love and concern they'd professed was conditional on my cooperation with their preferred solutions. That's a very serious step, I said calmly, though my heart was racing. Are you sure you want to pursue legal action against your own mother? We don't want to, Michael said quickly. But if you're not thinking clearly about your own safety and security, we have to consider all options. Not thinking clearly. The same accusation they'd been making since they first heard about my surgery. The assumption that age and medical treatment had somehow impaired my judgment. They'd convinced themselves that disagreeing with their plans was evidence of cognitive decline. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for exactly this threat. Susan Blake had worked through the night to create legal protections that would make guardianship proceedings extremely difficult and expensive. I had formal competency evaluations, updated advance directives, and property protections that would survive even successful guardianship petitions. But I wasn't ready to reveal those cards yet. Let my children continue to believe they held all the legal advantages, while I gathered more information about their true intentions. Before we discuss legal proceedings, I said carefully, I'd like to understand something. This development deal you've been negotiating. What's your role in it beyond helping me evaluate options? The question clearly made them uncomfortable. Stephanie fidgeted with her folder while Brian examined his fingernails with sudden interest. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear, entirely. "We may have arranged to receive a small finder's fee if the sale goes through," Brian admitted finally. "Compensation for identifying the property and facilitating negotiations. A finder's fee. My children weren't just managing my affairs. They were profiting from the destruction of my home." The conflict of interest was staggering, but it explained their urgency and determination to close the deal despite my objections. "How much of a finder's fee?" I asked. "It's a standard industry practice," Stephanie said defensively. "Real estate professionals always receive compensation for successful transactions. You're not real estate professionals. You're my children. How much?" 5% of the sale price, Michael mumbled. "Split 3 ways. 5% of $1.2 million, $60,000 divided among my 3 children for convincing me to sell my home to developers who would tear it down. They had substantial financial incentives to override my preferences and push through the development deal." The revelation was devastating, but clarifying. My children's concern for my welfare was genuine, but it was compromised by their financial interest in relocating me. They'd convinced themselves that what was profitable for them was also beneficial for me, a rationalization that allowed them to pursue their financial interests while feeling virtuous about protecting me. "I see," I said quietly. "So your advice about my best interest comes with a significant financial incentive for you to persuade me to accept a particular course of action." "It's not like that," Brian protested. "We genuinely believe this is the best solution for everyone involved." "Best for everyone financially," I corrected, "but not necessarily best for me personally, emotionally, or practically." Frank had been listening to these revelations with obvious disgust. "Let me understand this correctly. You've been pressuring Linda to sell her home to developers who will destroy everything she's worked to create, and you're getting paid to facilitate that destruction?" "The house would have to be sold eventually anyway," Stephanie said defensively. "This way, everyone benefits from the transaction." "Everyone except Linda, who loses her home, her garden, her neighborhood, and her independence," Frank pointed out. "But I suppose that's acceptable as long as everyone else profits from the arrangement." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment. My children had been caught in the uncomfortable position of having financial interests that directly conflicted with my expressed preferences. Their concern for my welfare was real, but it was tainted by their eagerness to profit from my displacement. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had been said and revealed. "I think this conversation has covered enough ground for today. You've made your position clear, and I've made mine clear. We appear to be at an impasse." "Mom, please don't make any hasty decisions," Brian pleaded. "Give us time to work out the details. Maybe find alternative arrangements that address your concerns." "I'm not making hasty decisions," I replied. "I'm maintaining the position I've held consistently since this conversation began. I want to stay in my own home, and I'm financially and practically capable of doing so." "But the development opportunity won't wait," Stephanie pressed. "If we don't respond soon, they'll move on to other properties." "Then I guess they'll have to move on," I said simply. "Because I'm not selling my home to developers under any circumstances." After my children left, Frank and I sat in stunned silence processing everything that had been revealed. The scope of their planning, the financial incentives driving their urgency, the legal threats they were prepared to make against me all painted a picture of family dysfunction I'd never anticipated. "I'm sorry, Linda," Frank said finally. "I never imagined they would go this far." "Neither did I admitted. I knew they were concerned about my welfare, but I didn't realize they were financially invested in overriding my decisions." "What do you want to do now?" The question forced me to consider my options carefully. I could continue trying to reason with my children, hoping they would eventually respect my autonomy, even if they disagreed with my choices. I could implement the legal protections Susan had prepared and dare them to follow through on their guardianship threats. Or I could take the offensive and expose their financial conflicts of interest publicly. I think it's time to have a family meeting of my own, I said. One where I control the agenda and reveal some information my children don't know I have. 2 days later, I called my children and asked them to come for Sunday dinner. I told them I'd been thinking about everything they'd said and wanted to discuss some new possibilities. They arrived promptly at 5 o'clock, clearly hopeful that I'd come to my senses and was ready to accept their guidance. Frank had helped me prepare a beautiful meal featuring vegetables from my garden and James's favorite recipes. The dining room table was set with our best china and silver, creating an atmosphere of celebration rather than confrontation. I wanted my children to remember this meal, to associate it with the moment they learned who their mother really was. "This is lovely, Mom," Stephanie said, admiring the table setting and the flowers Frank had arranged from the garden. "It feels like old times." "That's exactly what I was hoping for," I replied. "A chance to remind us all of what family really means." We enjoyed a pleasant meal with conversation about their work, their children, their various activities and interests. For a brief time, it felt like we were simply family gathered around a table, sharing food and stories without hidden agendas or ulterior motives. But after dessert was served and coffee was poured, I stood up and moved to the sideboard where I'd placed a manila envelope. "Before we discuss my housing situation any further," I said, returning to my seat, "I think you should know about some arrangements I've made to protect my interests and ensure my wishes are respected." I opened the envelope and distributed copies of documents Susan had prepared. Property protection trusts, updated wills, formal competency evaluations, and detailed financial statements showing the full scope of my assets. My children read in silence, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock, to something approaching awe as they absorbed the reality of my financial position. The numbers were substantial enough to eliminate any practical justification for their intervention in my life. "This changes everything," Brian said finally. "No," I replied. "This reveals that everything you thought you knew was incorrect. I haven't changed. Your assumptions about me were simply wrong." "But why didn't you tell us sooner?" Michael asked. "We've been worried about you for months." "Because I wanted to see what you would do when you thought I was vulnerable," I said honestly. "I wanted to understand whether your concern for me was genuine care or disguised control." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Stephanie asked quietly. "That you love me and want to protect me, but you've forgotten that protection doesn't mean taking away someone's choices. You've confused what would be convenient for you with what would be best for me." The documents on the table made several things clear. First, I had the financial resources to live exactly as I chose for the rest of my life. Second, I had legal protections that would make guardianship proceedings extremely difficult and expensive. Third, I'd been planning for my future far more carefully than they'd realized. "The house is protected by an irrevocable trust that prevents sale for commercial development," I explained. "My will specifies that it should be preserved as a family property or donated to the Historical Society if none of you want to maintain it. Your finder's fee arrangements with the developers are now irrelevant." "Mom, we never meant to profit from your misfortune," Brian said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not, but you were willing to profit from my displacement. There's a difference." The remainder of the evening was spent in awkward conversation, as my children absorbed the reality that their mother was far more capable and prepared than they'd imagined. Their plans to relocate me had been based on false assumptions about my vulnerability, and those assumptions were now exposed as wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment. When they prepared to leave, each of them hugged me with a mixture of affection and bewilderment. They'd come expecting to finalize arrangements for my relocation, and instead discovered that their mother had outmaneuvered them completely. "What happens now?" Stephanie asked as she stood on the front porch. "Now you decide whether you can respect my choices even when you disagree with them," I replied. Whether you can love me enough to let me live my own life. We're going to need time to process all this, Michael said. Take all the time you need. I'll be here in my own home, living my own life, making my own decisions, just as I've been doing for 67 years. After they left, Frank and I cleaned up the dinner dishes in comfortable silence. The confrontation was over, the truth was revealed, and the battle for my independence was won. My children might continue to worry about me, but they could no longer dismiss my capabilities or override my decisions. "How do you feel?" Frank asked as we finished putting away the china. "Tired," I admitted, "but victorious, and grateful to have friends who respect my right to make my own mistakes." "You haven't made any mistakes that I can see." "Maybe not. But I've learned something important about family dynamics and the difference between love and control." As I prepared for bed in my own house, in my own room, surrounded by my own possessions and memories, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning arguments or exposing deceptions. I felt the satisfaction of a life lived according to my own values, a home preserved for future generations, and relationships that had survived the test of conflicting interests. My children had fought over my house while I was in surgery, forgetting that I could hear everything. They'd learned that their mother was still very much present, very much capable, and very much determined to protect what mattered most to her. The surgery had been meant to repair my heart, but the real healing had come from defending my home, my independence, and my right to live and die according to my own choices. Some battles are worth fighting, and some victories are worth the cost of winning them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.